Well, hello and welcome back to Aim in Practice, where I have the immense pleasure of sitting down with a diverse array of practitioners, experts, and authors. And together we delve into their unique journeys and insights and explore this beautiful and multifaceted world of wellness and life as a practitioner. Now, today, I have the privilege of hosting a conversation that is not only very near and dear to my heart, but also critical to understanding a topic that is still shrouded in unnecessary stigma, and that's cannabis and its medicinal use. This is a conversation that I've been looking forward to for a pretty long time. Something that I've not talked about at all is how cannabis genuinely played a significant role in my recovery from a very serious accident. Both THC and CBD really influenced my recovery during a time when I was told that I would likely have my right foot amputated. Now, this was a huge period in my life. Not only was I in a massive amount of physical pain, but somebody like a doctor saying they're likely going to have to amputate your foot, as an athlete, that was profoundly psychologically impactful as well. Now, this is a topic that I've been pretty reluctant to discuss, which is odd because where I live, cannabis has been legal for both recreational and medicinal use for quite a long time, and yet there is still a stigma surrounding cannabis. So today you'll hear my conversation with Kayla Sanmartin. Kayla is a pioneering cannabis nurse and co-founded Cannabis Nurses, a practice dedicated to integrating cannabis into holistic healthcare, and she's developed the very first fully accredited holistic cannabis nursing program in Canada. Now, what's important to understand is this isn't just an episode where we're saying, yay, cannabis. We really dig into the science behind it, and very specifically, we spend a lot of time talking about the endocannabinoid system.
Anybody in a wellness healing profession needs to know about the endocannabinoid system. This endocannabinoid system, being the master regulator of the human body, is responsible for bringing homeostasis or balance to things like our mood, our appetite, how our body senses pain, how we file traumatic memories, our digestion, our sleep, even our body temperature. It's involved in every physiological function in the human body.
And throughout our discussion, Kayla shares how cannabis serves as an incredible tool for healthcare professionals, enhancing other modalities like massage, acupuncture, and yoga. And we really delve into, like I said, the specifics of the endocannabinoid system and how it can be nourished through various other practices, not just through the use of cannabis, but through things like yoga and movement.
I didn't sleep at all. I didn't sleep for over 21 days, and it led to the loss of my first pregnancy. And so in that darkness, in that grieving, I felt like there was something completely wrong with me. Why couldn't I sleep? And now I had lost my first baby, that I finally decided that things really had to change. I feel very blessed to be a health professional that was able to take one of their darkest moments in their life and be able to turn it into one of their brightest.
Kayla underscores the importance of understanding the historic and cultural context of cannabis, which I agree is super important. And she emphasizes the need to break down the stigmas and educate health practitioners about the benefits and the safe use of this powerful herb. And her journey goes from skeptic nurse to passionate advocate, and it really is quite inspiring.
And my life changed. My husband, who had known me most of my life, said, "There you are, you're back, you're bright again."
And Kayla Sanmartin truly is an inspiring and amazing human, and she offers her perspectives on how holistic practices, including cannabis education, can help us find that sense of peace and security, and how cannabis is a transformative tool for both practitioner and client. Join us as we jump right into this conversation and explore some pretty profound and transformative topics. Well, Kayla, welcome. I'm really looking forward to our chat today. So you and your partner Heather, you run a company called Cannabis Nurses, and I first was introduced to what you do through a mutual friend, Shirley, who was also a guest on the podcast. And as soon as she described to me what you do, I was immediately interested in talking with you. Of course, where we both live in Alberta and Canada at large, cannabis is decriminalized. You can go to the store, you can buy it, it's no problem, right? Which has led to a lot of really interesting developments as far as how it's used, and in some cases, I suppose, how it's abused. But most importantly, it's opened up the doors for a lot more people to actually reap the benefits of what it can do as a herb. So my background, I studied herbs and herbology, and I always found the cannabis plant to be a super fascinating plant as far as its herbal properties. So I want to dig into that. But first, I'd love it if you could just share a little bit about the backstory. What led you to, well, essentially create an entire business that's based around cannabis to the point where that's, as far as I understand, well, what you really do.
Yeah, I feel very blessed to be a health professional that was able to take one of their darkest moments in their life and be able to turn it into one of their brightest. This cannabis nursing practice branches back to what I wished I would have had when I found medical cannabis. So that would have been about 7 years ago now. So pre recreational legalization. And as I go through Western medicine's like thought process in regards to nursing, and what I knew to do at that time was, something was wrong. I wasn't able to sleep. I was working shifts and I wasn't sleeping, and I felt really alone, really anxious. So if something's wrong with you, you go to the doctor. And so that's what I did. I went to the university doctor. I was prescribed an SSRI medication for anxiety and sleeping pills. And thankfully, at the time, that I did need that. I needed something to stabilize and be able to sleep again. And I did. I started to sleep again. I felt like complete garbage every day when I woke up because of the hangover effect and the side effect of those pills. But thank God I wasn't spending an entire night alone, anxious at the age of 21, unable to sleep. And those sleeping pills became part of my life for the next 6 years. In that time, I was doing work with psychologists and, really kind of trying to get to the root cause of this, but was never really able to find the root cause of it. And so those sleeping pills were my tool that helped me finish nursing school, got me into my full-time career as an RN. And unfortunately, I became heavily dependent on sleeping pills for those 6 years. And I always say it was one of more of those universal moments where the universe sort of came and kicked me in the ass and said, okay, enough's enough. Things have to change.
Hmm.
And I'd been on them for 6 years, and I unexpectedly became pregnant after I got married. And I thought,
Hmm.
here it is. Here is my solution. Here is my message. I'm going to finally be able to kick these to the curb. And believe me, I never wanted to be on them, but I didn't know what else to do. And so I flushed my pills down the toilet and I said, here we go. Here comes first trimester fatigue. Like, this is my message. This is my sign. And
Hmm.
it was 3 weeks into that journey that I didn't sleep at all. I didn't sleep for over 21 days. And it led to the loss of my first pregnancy. And so, in that darkness, in that grieving, I felt like there was something completely wrong with me. Why couldn't I sleep? And now I had lost my first baby, that I finally decided that things really had to change. And so my husband actually had been a rec cannabis user for most of his life and or most of his adult life. And honestly, as a nurse, I didn't like it. I really didn't like it. And my husband remembers me walking out of our room after it'd been 3+ weeks of no sleep. And I said, roll me a joint. And he goes, okay, runs to the garage to roll a joint because he's like, probably been thinking for the last 6, 7 years that this would help me. And so I started to consume cannabis then, and it started to change my life. I started to be able to rest. I started to not be filled with absolute debilitating anxiety leading into the night. And I started to sleep. But I said, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this right. And
Hmm.
so at that time, we had just started to have more medical cannabis clinics available, but the one in Edmonton was booked forever. And so we took days off work, and my husband drove me down to Calgary to get my medical license for cannabis. And I sat in that waiting room to get my prescription, and I was sweating. My heart was beating. I felt like I was doing something wrong. And so I obtained my license and I started to consume cannabis, and my life changed.
Hmm.
My husband, who had known me most of my life, said, there you are, you're back, you're bright again. I didn't wake up
Wow.
every morning feeling hungover. My anxiety reduced significantly. And instead of dreading the night, I started to look forward to the night. And that was the first time in 7 years that I was able to feel that way. And then that opened the
Hmm.
floodgates. I needed to know more. I needed to know more about this plant. I needed to know more about this, my own stigmas that I held about this plant. Where did they come from? And so I started to dive into education around cannabis, and I was self-educating for, 6 or 7 years leading into creating my practice. And it was like literally just out of my own personal need, interest, passion. And I started to coach a bunch of nurses in the Emerge I worked with how to get into the medical cannabis program, how to use cannabis. And I started to realize well, I'm being a nurse still, but I'm just teaching people about cannabis. I'm not teaching
Hmm.
them in the emergency department, or I'm not teaching them about their diabetic meds. I'm teaching them about cannabis. Where the
Hmm.
heck do I fit in this? And so I just kept educating and being really curious, really passionate about it. And it was on my maternity leave with my second son that I started to realize that there wasn't a place where I fit yet. And so I needed to make my own place. And so through the Canadian Institute of Integrative Nursing Development and Education, I took a program about how do you start your own business as a nurse? How do you start your own practice? And so I started on that journey there. And then they caught wind of me and they said, "What are you doing? What kind of practice are you building?" And I told them about my cannabis nursing practice that was going to focus on women's health. And this is, what I was envisioning with it. And they said, "You're our person." And I said, What do you mean I'm your person?" And they said, "We've been looking for a nurse to write us a holistic cannabis nursing program." So I was put through their holistic nurse coach program. And then I branched into creating the first accredited holistic cannabis nursing program in Canada that launched on 4/20 of last year. And I call that my third child, or I guess
Yeah.
ultimately my fourth.
Yeah.
That was really driven by the loss of my first. And so that program launched out, and our practice has been building over time. And we have some referral bases that have allowed us to expand across Western Canada at this point.
Well, thank you. I mean, there's a lot of interesting bits within your story. What I found myself most curious to is this idea of creating a program. So one of the companies that I run, AIM Online Education, and I definitely get what you mean. It's like childlike. It is all
Hmm.
consuming as far as energy and focus goes. So I get it, but
Hmm.
I'm really interested in the process of educating wellness practitioners. My primary
Hmm.
demographic are going to be massage therapists, acupuncturists, osteopaths, yoga teachers, so on and so forth, right? But I'm curious, when you were asked to develop this program, what
Hmm.
do you teach people, and are you mostly just focused on nurses or multiple different forms of wellness practitioners?
So within this program with the Kind, because it's a nursing institute for continuing education, the program is completely put through a nursing lens. And so this program that is out and launched right now is specifically for nurses. That being said, the co-owner of our practice, she's a recreational therapist. And so we have on our goal list and intentions to take that program, take the nursing lens off it, and for it to be for allied health professionals, because everybody needs to know about the endocannabinoid system. When you listed, you mostly work with acupuncture, massage, osteopathy, yoga instructors. All of those modalities nourish the endocannabinoid system. So the same system that cannabis nourishes in the body.
Hmm.
And so we have absolute intentions of expanding that out to other healthcare professionals. Anybody in a wellness healing profession needs to know about the endocannabinoid system.
I really appreciate that, and I'm curious what level of awareness you're bringing to the allied health professions. And the reason I ask is when it comes to say, for example, acupuncture, we look at it as a herb. We're not allowed to prescribe it, but if somebody comes into our clinic and we understand that they're under the influence, it's like, okay, fine, no problem, carry
Mm-hmm.
on with the session, right? But in other professions such as massage therapy, many of the standards of practice have it listed very clearly that one, if you suspect somebody's under the influence of cannabis, then you cannot treat them. Two, you're not allowed to use any cannabis-based products. Like there's really strict rules
Mm-hmm.
around everything related to cannabis, largely in the massage therapy industry. So I'm curious. Do you have any projects, or are you working on sort of broadening the education of what the endocannabinoid system does and how it works, and maybe take some of the stigma off of it?
Oh, absolutely. And it really doesn't surprise me to hear that, we sort of categorize cannabis right alongside alcohol or like illicit street drugs like cocaine or heroin or something like that, right? So, to take that liability off yourself, you absolutely, they cannot be under the influence. I'm under the influence of cannabis right now. It's just non-intoxicating. You just can't
Mhm.
tell, right? So, I think like where sort of that the piece comes when we're defining stigma, a lot of it comes back to actually like examining closer into the history of cannabis and really understanding where does that stigma come from. This is a plant that the origins, we don't even know the full origins of this plant. Somewhere between 6 to 10,000 years ago, it was likely found in some Southeastern Asian mountains. And then from there followed our trade routes and came over to North America in the pockets of slaves and in the early 1800s. But when we look back at the history of cannabis and we really start to examine that we lost it for that 100 years because of prohibition, we didn't lose this plant and it became illegal because it was incredibly dangerous. Cannabis has never caused an overdose death, nor physiologically can it. Somebody can consume way too much THC and do something really irresponsible and cause death or injury or harm, but nobody's heart has ever stopped breathing or their lungs stopped breathing. Heart stopped beating and their lungs stopped breathing
Yeah.
because of ingesting too much THC. And so when we look into that history and really, really see that our prohibition of cannabis is really rooted in, racism, patriarchy, and greed, not in harm. And that actually at that time, physicians stood up in court and said, you can't do this. And if you do, we lose our ability to research and prescribe this herb. And so that's actually like a big piece of the cannabis nursing program is taking a really deep dive into the historical use of cannabis and that evolution through time of it being an illicit drug and then being removed from the schedule in Canada and becoming, part of a medical program and then a recreational legalization. And so I think that's a big piece of it. But then also, when we talk cannabis, we can't not talk about the endocannabinoid system. And that massage therapist is stimulating the endocannabinoid system through their touch because there's receptors for cannabis all throughout the skin. Acupuncture is increasing the receptors for the endocannabinoid system in the brain. Osteopathic treatments do that. Yoga and breath work also nourish this endocannabinoid system and boost our own body's own made cannabis. And so when we start to go through our evolution of history, which then leads into the discovery of the endocannabinoid system, the plant becomes a lot less scary. And that, what we're really missing there when we see those really stigmatized, statements, even in this like legal liability piece of these practices, is lack of education. It's really ignorance in the end, actually. So I would love to sit down with those boards and be like, here's your education. What are we actually
Yeah.
scared of?
Yeah, exactly. I'm curious, can we maybe just nerd out just a little bit and dig into the
Always.
endocannabinoid system? Because I also
Always.
find it so fascinating. And what I really appreciate that you've already referred to several times is how things like body work, breath work, simply moving the body through stretches, all of these things we do that the intrinsic senses, that feels good, and I enjoy doing that. To some extent, play excuse me. To some extent, play with the endocannabinoid system. So, can you sort of dig in and maybe let's just work on let's just talk about how massage, for example, would start to play with and work with the endocannabinoid system and what's actually happening sort of in the, the deepest level.
Yeah, I always joke. I always say like my curly hair is as big as my nerd brain, so I'm happy to nerd out anytime.
Awesome, awesome,
Um,
awesome.
but ultimately, the endocannabinoid system was discovered late 80s, early 90s. And this is a time in our history where the AIDS epidemic is really driving advocacy and legal access to cannabis. So you think we'd start to study, well, why is THC helping them? Why is this cannabinoid helping them? But no, it was just like, no, let's just find out why THC makes you high. So it was in Jerusalem that they put radioactive material in the THC molecule and then watched the human body consume THC. And literally from head to toe, they watched the entire human body light up with receptors for THC. And they were like, oh, okay, what is this? And so that was the ultimate discovery of the endocannabinoid system. And this endocannabinoid system is a very integral part of human health. So at 7 weeks gestation, that fetus that is a blob with a beating heartbeat has an endocannabinoid system by that point in gestation. All animals have an endocannabinoid system except insects. And what this endocannabinoid system is doing is bringing homeostasis to the body or balance. So we can think about this endocannabinoid system like the body's thermostat. It's trying to do is bring the body's function into a comfortable room temperature, into a beautiful balance. And so this endocannabinoid system, being the master regulator of the human body, is responsible for bringing homeostasis or balance to things like our mood, our appetite, how our body senses pain, how we file traumatic memories, our digestion, our sleep, even our body temperature. It's involved in every physiological function in the human body. And the reason cannabis is so safe is, it's not benign, but it's safe, is that in the brainstem, we barely have any endocannabinoid receptors, or none at all. And that's the only place in the human body that we don't have receptors for cannabis. And so when they discovered that THC was binding and discovered this endocannabinoid system and these receptors all over the human body, they had to go looking further. Our bodies are not equipped with a system and receptors for a plant that's external to our body. So what is our body making that's binding to these receptors? And so that was the discovery of anandamide and something else called 2-AG. And so that's our body's own made cannabis. Anandamide comes from the Sanskrit word ananda, which means extreme bliss or joy. And interestingly, the THC molecule is almost structured the same as anandamide. So where our body's own endogenous cannabinoid anandamide binds, our external or phytocannabinoid from the plant can also bind. And interestingly enough, there is no pharmaceutical that can access the endocannabinoid system. They've tried, and they've nearly killed people in clinical studies trying to sort of find something that could access this system. And so this endocannabinoid system, the phytocannabinoids, the plants can access it. And then that's why cannabis can work for so many things. Well, why does that person use it for seizures? That person uses it for chronic pain. They use it for PTSD. They use it for tremors. They use it for sleep. Seems too good to be true as per our sort of Western medicine minds. It's because it accesses this endocannabinoid system, this master regulator of the human body. And when we look at this endocannabinoid system, yes, cannabis can access it, but our lifestyles can either dysregulate it or they can support it. And so, our modern day world is really, really fabulous at dysregulating this endocannabinoid system. So things like alcohol, multiple prescription drugs, smoking cigarettes, all of those dysregulate the endocannabinoid system. So a hangover, perfect example of endocannabinoid system disruption. Changes in our mood, in our memory, ability to sleep, anxiety, digestion changes, all of these things are caused by a hangover, by alcohol, right? Other things that dysregulate is poor sleep, high levels of chronic stress, processed foods, aging, and then fluctuating hormones within female all dysregulate this endocannabinoid system. And then this is where that allied health piece comes in. Our lifestyles can support the endocannabinoid system. So living healthy lifestyles, eating whole foods, nourishing our gut health, yoga and breath work, exercise. They say exercise for endorphins, get that runner's high. It's not the endorphins. They boost about this much. It's anandamide. It's an extreme boost in anandamide that makes us feel good. It makes us feel blissful after exercise. And then our treatments like acupuncture, osteopathy, massage, all nourish this endocannabinoid system. And then again, that's why so many people would use acupuncture for so many different things. And same with massage. You're not just going in there and you're getting treatment, say, for one painful area in the body. It's all interconnected, right? And that interconnection comes because of the endocannabinoid system.
That is so cool. That's so cool. I think
Isn't it?
It's like, on one hand, for some people it might be, it takes the magic out of it. We're supposed to just think like something like acupuncture just works because of chi and all of these mystical properties, which certainly might be true. But I also really appreciate that if we look at it slightly different, it's equally, in my opinion, even more magical to consider the fact that evolution built right into us this holistic system that is shockingly easy to access endogenously, and also a plant that allows us to access it exogenously, right? That to me is like, wow, that's magic that exists.
And yeah, when we come from these, like for me, from a nursing Bachelor of Science, it's very scientifically based. Here now I have my scientific basis to explain why my body loves yoga and breathwork and acupuncture and cannabis and massage. Here is my actual evidence to show you why and explain why our bodies are loving that. Or for me, it gives me a basis to explain to some of my clients maybe why they are struggling in so many areas of their life, is because we're stuck in these areas that dysregulate. Or look at the pandemic. Chronic levels of stress and mental health are worse than the most poor that they've ever been. But when we put society through a chronic level of stress for that extended period of time, we're dysregulating the endocannabinoid system. So it's no wonder people are seeing increase in things like pain, poor sleep, anxiety, depression.
Hmm.
It's just like, in the end, it's just this like really deep physiological understanding about kind of the human experience, in my opinion.
Hmm. My own personal relationship with cannabis, I didn't consume any form of it until, I don't know, mid 20s or something like that. And then I was some friends like, hey, you want to pop? And I'm like, sure, whatever. Didn't like it, right? So it wasn't until
Hmm.
probably close to my 30s that I actually started to consume it on a semi-regular basis. But it was only after a very severe injury that it
Hmm.
became a more regular part of my life. So some of the listeners will know the story, but what ended up happening is I got into a really nasty climbing accident, completely shattered my ankle, so much so that the doctor was saying we need to amputate. Like it was bad. And when I was living in a van at the time, so I was traveling around. I didn't have a regular doctor, and nobody was prescribing me pain meds. So I'm like, okay, well, I know that this can help. And I also read a study at the time, which I haven't looked into since, that was saying that high dose CBD, which I'd like to talk about perhaps later, high dose CBD, sorry, uh, increases rates of bone healing. But that was another
It
reason.
does. I was hoping you
Yeah.
were going to say that.
Okay. Yeah. I read this study. And so after I read that study, I'm like, okay, I went out and at this time, it wasn't yet legalized recreationally. So you still did need, but I was in BC at the time. And in BC, for some reason, even prior to recreational legalization, you could just go into a store and buy things. So I go to like 10 different stores and I buy like almost $1,000 worth of CBD, because the study I read was in mice and it didn't have appropriate doses. It was just kind of like, here's what we
Mhm.
did. So I'm basically just like chugging this stuff. I can't even remember how much I took, but
Yeah.
massive amounts. I genuinely think that played a significant role in why I am now able to walk pretty much pain free. But
Hmm.
as that sort of continued, I healed, and now cannabis was part of my life. And at the time, I went through some like really horrific emotional things, and like a relationship ended. And it was just like a terrible time of life. So then for me, it turned from this thing that I was using to help me with pain and help me with bone healing to something I was using to escape, to turn my brain off, to just like
Hmm.
check out. And I personally felt like it was not a good part of my life anymore.
Hmm.
And I'm sorry to sort of bogart that with this story, but I'm getting somewhere with this, which is what I eventually discovered is when I would consume cannabis and just kind of sit there and like watch Netflix or play video games or whatever, universally I felt like crap. I felt shameful. I would feel lethargic. I would wake up with a hangover for some reason. Oh, Lord knows my diet went out the window, and I'm pretty strict about my diet. But what I ended up realizing several years later, after I had fully healed, is if I would consume just a bit of cannabis, maybe have a hoot off of a vaporizer pen or something like that, and go for a run, life change. It wasn't like I felt stoned or anything like that, but I'd hit
Hmm.
that runner's high. At the same time, my assumption is that the sort of cannabis high was reaching its peak, and it was
Yep.
blissful and euphoric beyond words. And then I'd finish my run and be ready to go about my day. So I found that this combination of running, of things like yoga, even of weightlifting, combined with cannabis, is just like a huge benefit to me. But not so much just sitting around watching TV, right?
Yeah.
So what I'm getting at with this is, and I'm sure there's a few things we could pick apart in there, is what's the difference? Like, why is it that this plant seems to at sometimes really not feel good or beneficial, but at other times really feel like this is a life changer?
That's a great question, and like such a beautiful example about how our relationship with cannabis can really shift. And really, what it comes back to is the intention behind the use. It's that intentional use. Are we using it as a catalyst kind of tool that can help us engage in healthy behaviors that support the endocannabinoid system? Or are we borderlining upon that, the cannabis use disorder, where it's really leading us into dysregulation of the endocannabinoid system? Without intentional use, THC can hurt the endocannabinoid system. When those receptors in the brain for cannabis, the endocannabinoid receptors in the brain, are flooded with THC all the time, those receptors are like, we're sick of this. We've seen enough of this. And the receptor actually will pop back inside of the cell And so with overuse of THC, we've downregulated the endocannabinoid system. And so it's very, very much about intentional use. And in our practice, we are referred a lot of clients with cannabis use disorders, or maybe if we're not necessarily quite to a use disorder yet, where they're using it as escapism. Because it's a powerful way to escape. Cannabis is known as an entheogen. So that is changing perception. When it's used in a very intentional way, can be a very powerful tool to help us look at life situations differently, be sort of an additive tool to help us engage in things like you mentioned, exercise, weightlifting, yoga, those kinds of things. But it can also flip on the other side. So it's very much knowing about the reason why behind the use and also having that education. And in our practice, it's very important to us that each individual, by the time of their interaction with us, feels educated, empowered, and relatively unapologetic in their use because it's based in education and support. But one thing I did want to sort of pull out of that conversation is the person that you were describing, or where you were in your life when you came to cannabis, really is reflective of our statistics. You were in a very vulnerable place. You're a very vulnerable individual. You didn't have a prescriber. Maybe you didn't want to take narcotics. And you had this injury that literally could have changed your life completely. And that's why we created our practice, is because those that come to cannabis are typically in a very vulnerable place. When we statistically look back at the reasons why people are using medical cannabis in Canada, the top two reasons are they either prefer natural treatments or their other treatments weren't working or they had severe side effects. They tend to be over the age of 55 on multiple pharmaceuticals. Right then and there, we paint a picture of a very vulnerable individual that maybe hasn't found the support they needed in Western medicine. And that can happen for various reasons. We don't need to get into that, but they're coming to cannabis as their last resort, hoping that they might find some hope, like find some light and some hope in that situation. And so we want to hold space for that vulnerability. We want to be there to teach them how to intentionally use cannabis to help build a baseline level of functioning. And maybe probably through your teachings and stuff, you've come across Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I'm guessing. Yeah.
Oh, yes.
So the way that I look at our practice is that we're helping people come to that baseline level of functioning with, like in Maslow's. So we don't reach our optimal health, wellness, quality of life without a solid foundation. And so cannabis can be a very powerful tool for a person that's very vulnerable, very dysregulated, to help to bring things like some pain control, some mood regulation, and sleep. From there, that individual is capable of achieving so many things. And so then from there, cannabis is our tool to get that baseline. And then from there, we're coaching and we're helping people to identify what it really means to bring quality of life and how can that lifestyle support my endocannabinoid system. So maybe somebody's been using alcohol to cope with trauma and pain and be able to sleep at night, but they wake up and they feel like garbage every day from it. And they don't want to be there, but they don't know what else to do. So then they're referred to us and we help them replace alcohol with cannabis, start getting really good quality sleep, getting some really good pain control, and also influence the mood. They're all interconnected. You can't separate any of those factors. And then from there, we help coach them and move them towards, well, I want to exercise again. I miss exercise, but I haven't been able to because of my pain. Okay, well, let's get your pain under control first. And then let's help coach you towards that intention of moving your body. And most of the time, the intention falls into place with relatively little to no effort because we're helping meet that baseline.
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate how you kind of established that this is a herbal plant, a natural substance that can really help meet that baseline. I mean, sleep just in itself. I mean, we could probably just have an entire 2-hour conversation on sleep and what that does. But something I'm curious about at this point is the benefits are vast and in many different systems of the body. I mean, even when I remember at one point in time, I was just going for a little run and I thought to myself, I think cannabis is also an egolytic. It allowed me to just step outside of my ego for a moment and just consider things from a different perspective. Like, and I do want to explore more of these really amazing sort of maybe even spiritual or psychological aspects of it. But for a moment, can we dip into the the side effects, if not even side effects, that's not the right word, but the negative aspects. When we've got cannabis use disorder, that's it. But are there like any things that one needs to be aware of? You know, the quote unquote bad trip or whatever it might be.
Hmm. Like when you green out, per se,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
when somebody
Get,
consumes.
anxiety attacks or something like that.
Hmm.
Or I've heard a lot of people say that they get really paranoid and they can't go out or something, even with a
Hmm.
relatively low doses. So can we address
Hmm.
those for a moment?
For sure. And like I sort of mentioned it a little bit earlier, that cannabis is widely safe, but it's not completely benign either.
Mhm.
And especially as, cannabis was prohibited. And so we had the illicit market. And, back in the day, when we really look historically back at cannabis, the THC percentages were quite low, where we might have even had more CBD in those strains. But then we hit the prohibition era and we have the illicit market. That's really starting to drive that high THC component of the plant. And this plant over the years has really been, has been breeded in a way that we're really like looking for those high THC components. But there's a lot more medicinal components to this plant. But then that's where we put, maybe some first time users at higher risk to having negative side effects. THC is very much, it's called a biphasic molecule. So at one dose, it does one thing, at another dose, it does another. So at a very, very micro low dose could be really amazing for somebody for anxiety. Too high of a dose, and we're causing anxiety. We're stimulating the receptors in the brain, we're creating a euphoric response. And so then that can lead into anxiety. And another thing that I think a lot of people have really bad experiences with THC is often maybe first time that you've tried it, it's in that sort of party setting. You already have alcohol on board, somebody gives you a puff, somebody hands you a brownie, right? And sure, why not, right? And it ends up being a really negative experience, high anxiety, paranoia, lots of fear, all of these sort of things. But alcohol boosts THC levels in the blood, increasing our
Mm,
risk of side effects. So knowing that co-administering those two substances can be relatively dangerous in a way of causing negative side effect. And so, like anything, it's so much about intention and about our dose. Cannabis dosing is so incredibly important. And the interesting thing, you said some can have just the most micro dose and have a negative experience, where some can keep consuming and it barely seems like they even have a response. And that comes back to the tone of the endocannabinoid system. Our tones are all so incredibly unique and incredibly different. How the body processes specifically edibles is really unique to each person. It depends on how much fat you have in your stomach. For a woman, it can depend where they are in their hormonal cycle, how we respond to an edible dose or an inhaled dose of cannabis, specifically THC. So there's a lot of nuances behind cannabis. And that's why I thought, how do we have this medical program in Canada, or now we have this recreational program? We have prescribers and we have vulnerable consumers, but we have no educator in the middle. Or if we
mhm.
do, they're actually not really educated when it comes to health.
Yeah.
They're not a nurse. They're not, and so I thought, how do we not have an educator in this when this literally is filled with so many nuances?
I mean, that's a really good point. When I went to get my medical prescription before it was legalized recreationally, I went into the doctor and the doctor's like, "What do you need?" And I'm like, "I'm not sleeping and I've got pain in my ankle." And the doc was like, "Cool," and wrote like a prescription, just like any old prescription. And in my mind, I'm like, "Well, that was easy." But
Mm-hmm.
in retrospect, it's like that's so bizarre because of how nuanced it is, particularly coming from my background of herbology and really studying herbs and
Mm-hmm.
really understanding the dose makes the poison. And it's
Mm-hmm.
just like, here, just whatever, we maybe take X number of milligrams a day, sure, but like very, very little guidance. And the fact
Mm-hmm.
that education is such an important part of what you do, I find absolutely essential. Can we talk about that dose a little bit, as far as
Mm-hmm.
how do you go about figuring out dosages, particularly because of all the different vectors, all the different ways one can consume cannabis now, from the leaf to oils to vaporizers to gummies to brown, there's just so many different ways. My experience has been, I have an edible, I am just racked with pain. I get crazy body pain. Can't have edibles. I also, if I have too many, I start to, get that vague hallucinogenic effect. So they don't work for
Hmm.
me, but that's through a lot of your experimentation. So what's your
Hmm.
process when you work with somebody who's either experienced or they're brand new to cannabis? How do you go about educating them on dose and method of consumption?
That's a great question. So I think a really important part of that is like a really extensive, holistic viewed intake. Starting to really understand like what pieces in their life are troublesome. What does your diet look like? When do you eat? Lots of different factors. We really do a comprehensive holistic assessment for an intake first to start to understand, you know, this person's human experience, and not just from, we're not just looking at your pain. We're looking at, all of those pieces: mental, physical, spiritual, your community around you, all of those pieces. And so that's sort of our introductory piece. But when it really comes to dosing, we actually really put the onus back on the individual. What's really unique about this medicine is that it's individual based. It is person driven. And so what we end up doing in that is we teach people how to self titrate their doses. What does it mean to do a self titration? So it means we start in low doses, we match that dose to time of day based on when they eat or how they want to consume it, because there's various reasons for different routes of admin, and I could really get into that. But we teach them how to slowly increase their dose over time, especially with CBD. CBD isn't a quick fix. It is full maximum potentials between 8 to 12 weeks. And especially when we're dealing with people that are really vulnerable, maybe having suffered with chronic conditions for a very long time, to cope, they really learn to dissociate from that sensation of chronic pain or mental health or anxiety. And when we create that safe environment and we start to build that therapeutic relationship through our intake and starting to understand their human experience, we actually ask them to come back into their bodies and become embodied and say, it's been probably a long time since you've really spent time focusing on, my pain levels, or what activities increase my pain level, or what situation increases your hypervigilance or your anxiety, or what triggers you if you have PTSD, all these things, or what nights do you have bad sleeps. But we ask them to become embodied, because ultimately, once they find sort of their baseline dose through that self titration, when they've really started to notice that things have changed, that their symptomology has changed inside their body, then we teach them how to ebb and flow that dose based on what's happening in their life and what messages their body's sending them. But we really want to really kind of hold their hand through that process, because we always say the plant will win you over in time, but we're going to be there to support you in this plant as you and your body learn this interaction with this plant. And ultimately, by the end of this, you're going to be able to feel safely embodied, respond to what your body's telling you, because you have this toolbox in front of you that's completely under your own control. You don't have to go to a doctor to ask for a dose increase. It is on you. And I know that can feel scary because we're very used to being told what to do in our Western medicine system. But now I want to put this power back. This is great. This is empowerment. This is you being able to take control over, say, your chronic pain. But you do have to feel it and learn how the plant and your chronic pain interact, so that you can feel empowered to change that dose when you need to change that dose.
That is so beautiful. I really
Thank you.
appreciate this idea of embodiment. That's
Mhm.
I have a huge number of conversations about embodiment. It's a big part of my own personal practice when I see clients, and a big part of the education that I provide. So the fact that that's sounding like a pretty significant foundational aspect of the process that you work through with people is so beautiful. Well, thank you for doing that, and also thank you for sharing that. So when we consider working with different groups of people, one thing that I'm interested in discussing is the people who do have dependency issues. They have been self-medicating, they have never worked with somebody like yourself, and they've gotten to that point of significant downregulation, whatever it might be, where it is problematic. What's the process you go through when working with an individual like that?
The first piece that we always make very clear to the individual is that there is no judgment here. There's a reason that your bodies love this plant. And there's a reason why you've sort of gravitated to it. So no different than when psychiatrists started to notice that undiagnosed or people with undiagnosed ADHD really had a tendency towards the plant. And we bring it back to educating them about the endocannabinoid system. Here is likely why your body has responded so well to replacing anandamide in your body with THC. And let's take a look at this and see, like, is your consumption really adding to your quality of life, or do you feel like it's actually taking away from it? And often where we really sort of see that use disorders with the inhalation method, it only, it works almost immediately, but it only lasts 2 to 4 hours. So we start sort of chasing this feeling, right? I smoke because my anxiety is really high and I can feel my pain elevating. So that's elevating my anxiety. So I smoke and I feel good for, an hour or two, and then I don't feel good again. And so I have to consume again. And they kind of put themselves on this roller coaster of managing symptoms, then not managing them, then managing them. And that really can perpetuate this use disorder because the body is really looking for that relief. And so then we start to pull it back a bit and we start to talk about, okay, when we start to flood these receptors with cannabis, and I've taught them about the endocannabinoid system, they're really excited about it and quite fascinated by it. And then we sort of say, when we start to flood this system with THC, we can actually start to downregulate it, or we can start to hurt this system. Oh, okay. So then one of the first steps that we've been using in our practice is, can we start to bring in non-intoxicating cannabinoids to start to help meet some of those needs? So if somebody's using high THC to help with pain and anxiety throughout the day, can we bring some CBD into the system? But can we do it in an oral route so that, we get 5 to 8 hours of duration of action that's level, that's straight across the board instead of up and down? And then they're, oh, okay, that would feel good. How can we capture how you feel at the top there of, your 1 to 2 hours of your inhalation method? How can we capture that in a way that takes away side effects? So when euphoria is not appropriate, it's a side effect. Can we take that away, but can we allow your body to feel that way using different cannabinoids? So we still use the plant that they love, but we're going to introduce different routes of administration and how they use it to start to find if we can find a more level relief from their symptoms using various roots and cannabinoids. And then from
Okay, that
there,
makes
when we
sense.
start to meet the need, then the use and need for high THC via inhalation method can start to fall away. But a big piece of that is the own individual's readiness for change and readiness to sort of look at that. But we typically just do it through non-judgmental education and support. Um, and if it's just a way of introducing some other cannabinoids into their life, then that's great too. Some that are no longer even having really positive benefit from inhaling THC, they're like, well, I don't feel high anymore. I don't feel any of that. Okay, let's explain why. You probably have like one receptor left in the brain, and they're, oh, okay. But then we might switch and say, like, have you ever tried to inhale CBD? That's the highest way or the best way to like absorb CBD. It doesn't mean it's the best way for your lungs, but that's our highest absorption rate is through inhalation. And so they might start to pull in some CBD into their inhalation method, and they'd be like, you know what, Kayla, that's actually really how I've wanted to feel.
Hmm.
And so then we can, as long as they're in that place for change, then we can start to open their eyes to like various other parts of this plant. This plant is just not just THC. And typically with understanding of the endocannabinoid system, we do have some pretty good outcomes with that. So
As you're describing your process of working with an individual, what's occurring to me is it seems as though the same thing is true with what you do in nursing as is what's true with us in acupuncture, massage, or anything like that. And it's you're a lot of bit of this modality and also a lot of bit counselor and psychologist. It really sounds like there's a lot of psychological and spiritual work you end up doing. Now, I'm not sure if the word spiritual would kind of land with you, but
yeah, no,
in my
absolutely.
perspective, yeah, it seems
It's one
like
of our
you're
like
doing more
areas
than
of yeah, it's one of
yeah.
our areas of holistic health. You can't ignore that spiritual aspect. And like our like driving theory behind our practice is like Gene Watson's theory of human caring. And so what we're really doing is the practitioner themselves is one of the most powerful therapeutic tools. And so being able to create that safe environment for that individual to really feel safe to start to dive into and start to understand their suffering. And
Mhm.
in that process, we're also giving them tools to help move them outside of that suffering. But in that, we have to acknowledge the suffering and start to make sense of it. For me, the cannabis plant helped me make sense of suffering from insomnia and losing a pregnancy over it. And now I can look back on that situation and realize that that was my building block and my foundation to rise out of that and create something else beautiful out of that. And so, yeah, I agree that that practitioner is just as powerful as their modality, as their acupuncture, as their massage, as their osteopathy, as my cannabis plant. But when we can put together a really powerful healing presence of a practitioner with a really healing modality, that's when the magic happens. You can just have a massage that's beating on your muscles and might kind of feel like it helps. But if you have that practitioner holding space for you and really sort of creating that safe environment for your body and your nervous system, that's where the magic happens.
Yeah. I'm mindful of the time, but there are two questions that I have in mind that I'm curious about. And I'm going to say them out loud now so I don't forget. One of which is this idea of collaborative care, which I want to address second. But the first I want to talk about is what happens long term. So when I've got clients come and see me for any issue, but we'll take pain because that's quite frankly the most common reason people come and see me. I really don't like the idea of come back and see me once a month for the rest of your life. And that is very much the model for good reasons and for bad reasons. One, pain is tricky. It's really hard to figure chronic pain out because there are so many things. So in my practice, solving, resolving, curing, haven't prepared to use that word, but getting rid of chronic pain, it's hard. It's very hard to do. So I've kind of come to accept that a lot of the time when I'm dealing with chronic pain clients, there's a very high probability that it's going to require ongoing care. Now, I'm curious when it comes to cannabis use, is that something that's somewhat similar? It's like somebody comes in with chronic pain, they've got this issue, insomnia, whatever it is, anxiety, and they realize that, okay, there's this herb, it's cannabis, and it can help me with my pain. Is there ever a point when it's no longer needed?
I think it really depends on, like you said, because chronic pain is so multifaceted, right? It's not just that it's an injury. It's the nervous system is involved, our environments are involved. And so, yeah, I do believe that there can be a place when somebody might not need cannabis anymore. My sister actually gives me a good example is, she was using cannabis at night to help her sleep. And then she really got into energy work and meditative practices and breath work. And she said, I don't need cannabis at night anymore. Amazing, because you're accessing your endocannabinoid system in a different way. And so ultimately, I guess we kind of hope that somebody might not need it forever because it could be that catalyst or that tool that helps them engage in those other behaviors that support the endocannabinoid system. Some of us with chronic conditions may need it forever. I know it'll likely be a part of my life forever for insomnia, and I'm okay with that. But I think as our life and our experience and our environment shift and change with us, our relationship with cannabis is going to change. And so we do have clients come back over time and ask questions because their life has changed. And so this is a tool that ebbs and flows with us, possibly through our entire life in places we might need more of it and times when we don't need as much of it. And that's where we love that embodiment piece and really teaching people to ebb and flow that dosing based on what's happening in their lives. If you've had a really rough day or your chronic pain is really high, then that makes sense. You're going to increase that dose. But cannabis can start to be that tool that helps us be able to have the capacity to start to explore those relationships between symptoms and environments and spirituality and family functioning and all those pieces, because we need a stabilization first before we can really be introspective and start to understand our experiences.
The word that you said is understand the relationships between these different facets of our life. And I like that word for a second reason, and that's my experience has been that we build relationships with all of the things which are regular parts of our life. Like we have a relationship with our food, we have a relationship with diet, we have a relationship with these things that aren't other people. And my experience, both with myself and also with friends and clients I've had who have cannabis as a part of their life, is it is a relationship that requires tending. Because if you keep moving forward, assuming it's going to be in your life the exact same way it was last year, that that's recipe for, in my opinion, some pretty crappy times, because just like
Mhm.
any relationship, it changes. It changes
Mhm.
depending on when was the last time you saw your friend, when how are you feeling, right? So treating it like a relationship and tending to it
Mhm.
at like a relationship, I think, is also another way to ensure a long-term healthy use.
Yeah, I like that, how like framing it with a relationship, because it very much is. It's a relationship that changes a lot over time. My relationship with the plant continuously changes.
Mhm.
Hmm.
So the last thing I want to discuss with you is this idea of collaborative care. When I have clients come in and I know that they're under the influence of cannabis, or at least I suspect, it's not something I'm going to ask outright necessarily,
Hmm.
but if I suspect, for myself, it's like, okay, great, actually, this is going to help me out. But as we discussed at the beginning of this conversation, there's weirdness with rules and standards of practice and different modalities here and there. Um, but that being said, is let's paint a picture of an ideal world in which this doesn't exist, in which somebody could come into massage therapy completely under the influence, and the practitioner doesn't have to worry about losing their license because they massage somebody under. So let's paint this beautiful picture in which collaborative care can exist. What sort
Hmm.
of combinations do you think would be like really, really helpful for clients? Let's go with dealing with pain, because again, that's the most common.
Awesome. I have this like the most beautiful anecdotal sort of scenario to share with you about collaborative care. So I had a chronic pain sufferer, low back chronic pain, got acupuncture on a regular basis. And how it worked best for them is they had their sort of baseline dose of CBD. And when that pain was worse, they could titrate in a very small amount of THC to receive more pain relief, but not feel intoxicated. CBD floods those cannabinoid 1 receptors in the brain, blocking them. So it blocks them from THC binding to them, creating a euphoric response, but allowing THC to bind, in small areas of the brain and elsewhere to create pain relief without euphoria. And so this worked well for them. They had a very busy lifestyle. They didn't have room to be stoned during the day, let's say. And so they consume their dose 1 hour before they go to their acupuncture appointment. They're on the acupuncturist table and they realize, oh, I'm high. Wait a second, I'm high. And what happens in acupuncture is we boost the cannabinoid 1 receptors in the brain. So we have more THC binding. The individual feels euphorically high during acupuncture. Not ideal by any means, driving and all those pieces. So she ends up waiting it out in the office until she felt the euphoric state go away and was felt safe to drive. She comes back to me and is able to report that she had her best pain relief for 3 weeks following that treatment.
Wow,
Don't you
that's
want to
super
study that?
cool.
I do.
Yes, definitely.
Isn't that fascinating?
That's super fascinating.
Or,
Wow.
like being able to use like cannabis topical with massage, would we have greater outcomes? Or
Hmm.
maybe if that person's on the table under the influence of a responsible dose of cannabis, do we have greater efficacy with that massage because instead of tensing against that pressure, they're able to sink into it, or, that we're
Yeah.
able to calm that nervous system. That plant is helping them put them into rest and digest. Then can that therapy
Hmm.
complement them even further?
Right. That
Mhm.
that's the case so often, is when we go in for a treatment. Say you're on the table for an hour, but the mind is like doing whatever it is for
Yep.
half of that. So you're paying for an
Yep.
hour, but you're really only experiencing half an hour because you're. Whereas on the other hand, if cannabis is involved, it's like the end of that hour, you're like, is that 5 hours?
Yeah, where you can like
It
sink
shifts
into
the.
the experience,
Hmm.
right? I always say you kind of jump off that, the hamster wheel. We can use cannabis in that
Yeah.
sense. And that actually speaks pretty profoundly. Like in the Hindi religion, when cannabis is paired with meditation, it becomes a bringer of freedom, the giver of joy, and the source of
Mm.
happiness. But often for many, meditation is really feels hard to not, that it's not accessible, right? With our busy minds. So if we can use this plant in an intentional way, help us tap into our bodies, help us tap into that meditation practice. And that's sort of what you described, right? That bringer of freedom, that giver of joy. And that's always massively resonated for me, for my bringer of freedom from my insomnia.
That's beautiful. So I'm going to ask you, the last question, which I ask everybody that's a guest on the podcast, and it's more of a general question. So, you as a practitioner, right? You're a nurse. You see a lot of patients and clients, and I'm sure you've also received a lot of treatments. So, with all of that in mind, in your opinion, what makes a practitioner really successful?
It's that intention that it's like if they're there as a practitioner, once we're aligned with our purpose, if that practitioner is aligned with their purpose, that's when that treatment becomes incredibly powerful. And I think another piece to that is that when that practitioner is able to be that powerful, it's also because they're caring for themselves. They have that capacity to care for others because they care for themselves. And so we're leading by that sort of that example, so that when that person walks in that's maybe feeling very vulnerable or dysregulated, as a practitioner, we have that capacity to hold space for that.
Beautiful, beautiful. I love it. Thank you so much. This
You're
was
so
a
welcome.
very wonderful conversation, very enlightening, and just an enjoyable chat from one end to the other. So thank you so much for your time.
You're so welcome. Thanks for having me.
Sure thing.